Now, some of the last parts of analyzing and going through the Quincy documentary on Netflix. I spoke about the integrationist ideas. I spoke about how he really exposed them, and he's talking about when he was making the documentaries with, the scores with the films with Sidney Poitier, and that was really a level where there was a fire in him for making something powerful that reflected the manhood and the black manhood that was being represented on screen. But he also tied it into his own personal thought about a better life of integration when he talked about interracial love, which has not and is not really a theme of any of the movies that he did for any of the Sidney Poitier films he did. And loosely, it would be one for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, but that isn't one that he did. But still, this really outlines his integrationist philosophy, his ideas, and why he was so well suited for this crossover of his life. You know what I mean? Besides the anomaly of his talent that I explained earlier. One other note that really kind of like shows that disagreement that I have, and that natural, I gotta call it natural pandering. I don't want to judge him, although saying someone's naturally pandering is. But when they talk about The Color Purple, Steven Spielberg says, "At first I resisted for all the obvious reasons. Then Quincy was saying, this is about race. This is not about race, but about humanity." And that made perfect sense to Steven Spielberg now to do it. But my thing is this, it doesn't make perfect sense to me. And for all the obvious reasons not to do Color Purple, I think I have different reasons why it shouldn't have been done, right? A movie that shows an image of the black man that is extremely negative, that is a realistic tale under that particular novel, but in the pantheon or in the type of small spectrum and the almost non-existent outlet for black films in the commercial realm, The Color Purple is an immediate stereotyping, and absolutely a bad image though in that time in 1985. You know, it's not like there's a whole bunch of black movies, but the only one got to be about that. But I have tons of other commentaries about The Color Purple, but let's go on, right? Other moments of his commercialization, beyond just the music that we're going to get into, is the Quest broadcasting, right? And obviously with the peak of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I think when we talk about hip-hop and what Quincy Jones did in hip-hop, I think it's an ideal example of something, a Fresh Prince being something that pitches everything acceptable about hip-hop culture that we respect, that the mainstream could also respect. So it's missing a lot of aspects, but it's stuff that we could respect that people could get with too. You know what I mean? So like throw everything that's in there that's okay, you know? And if you think these kind of things are usually done so premeditated, but throughout Quincy Jones' career, it shows that it's quite natural to him. And that's why shows like Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, by the time they're done, seem so fluid, you know what I mean? And again, I have to credit Quincy Jones, just like I do with Miles Davis for different reasons, in the ability to find talent. The ability to see where Will Smith was going to go is a rare type of talent. And every great musician, every great band leader, every great producer has that ability to see where an artist might go in his raw stages, whereas the average producer that is pop is usually seeing where he could change him towards. And I think Quincy was actually able to see people's pop potential as it naturally would evolve. You know, nothing never really feels forced. I'm going to see that as I go through the music. The other part that was very telling, though, was the Quincy Jones Hip Hop Symposium around mid-90s, 95, 96. And where he goes, the reason I fell in love with hip-hop is because it reminds him of bebop and his kinship with bebop. And the philosophy behind bebop was being hip. Being hip was being aware. This is what Quincy said in the documentary. And of course, we see that hip-hop is about being aware. Hip, right? Hip to the hop. And again, it shows a connection that one of the greatest connections that made him pop, but was totally sincere, was that Quincy Jones understood the connection of black music from the root blues to not only jazz as its foundation and its propelling realm, but also to the other musics, how blues goes into rock and roll, jazz goes into R&B, and all of these outlets into the funk and then into hip hop. But also it's cross black, the cross reference black diaspora. So the Latin musics, right, that go into such an integral part of jazz, right? The Latin polyrhythms that we'll build on a little bit, So in general, I thought that a lot of these aspects were really sincere in Quincy's life, even though he didn't have the complete perspective. Now, to end this, I'm going to, a must-watch documentary, I'm going to end it with my personal thoughts on Vibe magazine, right? This is something that he set up, and this is what I mean by where no matter how sincere you are in a pop phase, you wouldn't know what's going down in the dirt, down at the lowest level of where the core of hip-hop was made. And so he never saw hip-hop as a counterculture, but more like a subculture that would be wonderfully embraced and infused into the overall culture that would let others learn about the culture. You know what I mean? So bebop becomes absorbed as the entire pantheon of jazz. Jazz gets absorbed as a part of American music and folklore. And the people, white, black, everyone in between, understand everyone else more because of it. This is the dream essence of his thematic dream of music. Some ways it's right, some ways it's not. But my personal take on Vibe was really where one of the errors in that happens, because his idea was taking more of a dignified, universal approach in showing those kind of connections with all music to hip hop in Vibe magazine. But in reality, when you were there, as I was, what it really was a bourgeoisie version of what hip hop was. You know what I mean? And I could say that because when I was there, I was hired as an editor to do their website, their hip hop website that was grimy hip hop, and they called it "The Suicide," like a total crazy euphemism. You spell every part of the word wrong, and they never really let us go in there and do the work. They never really welcomed us to do that work, and it was always a conflict of interest, and it always was a problem where, like, oh, well, especially what I was writing was like, hey, you just wrote something that never really could go into the magazine. Like, that was always the thing. You didn't really write something that could go safely into the general website page. And, I was like, why? I'm writing about hip hop. They're supposed to fit into me, not me fit into them. Because I was young and I was like, fuck it. I don't adapt, So it's like in Kaz's latest album, the Orpheus versus the Sirens, he talks about hip hop, or he talks about giving you the ugly elegant. And Vibe chose to give hip hop as its elegant version. And it's an ugly elegant, as Kaz says, And if it's not in there, then it's not complete, But either way, the documentary peaks to me with the Ray Charles when he sings "My Buddy," and he does that. And I thought it was a beautiful part. And in general, though, I always had a lot of respect for him, just in collecting all his music, and I gained a greater respect for him because he did things with sincerity, and that's something that you see in the music. Absolutely. So let's go into this musical retrospective, right? We don't have much time, so we got to fast forward through it, and you'll see all these things to explore, right? And it's a stream. I've been stream of conscious through the whole thing. So some of these musical ideas, superimpose them with the themes I put in the beginning, first half of the show. But let's start with the jazz era, right? He starts as a trumpeter in the jazz era. And I'm going to talk about some of these solo albums or highlights to show some of the ideas, because I think in the root, just like jazz has the root of the blues, the root of all of his work is in the way he worked his jazz. And in this first era, I call it the jazz era, from 1956 to 1968, right? First off, he's a trumpeter with skills. It's not in the skills of really blowing. It's not in the skills of the detail of Miles Davis on the lower registers like Miles had, but it's consistent, and it always has a way of highlighting itself, which is where he translated into his composing and arranging, as particularly his arrangements. And if you listen to the album, this is how I feel about jazz, and you listen to Booze Blues, then you see what I mean by his chops. Like, he's got some good chops, you know what I mean? And obviously, he never played the trumpet after he got that aneurysm, and the two operations that went with that. when he got the brain aneurysm in 1974, around there, because he just couldn't do it after that. So he stopped doing the trumpet, and that's why more of his music goes pop, more of his compositions go worldly, because that's what he focused on, right? But to summarize, right, because this is where you get an idea of how all of the pop that he made with Michael and everyone else, though, made total sense. At this time in the late 50s, while the jazz innovators are going further from the mainstream, creating hard bop or delving into the future of modal jazz as Miles Davis did, Quincy is bringing a big band jazz into a soul jazz aesthetic. That means he's giving you like a soul jazz, but he's doing it with a big band. So you got to understand that if you're collecting jazz at that time, there aren't really that many big bands, you know? And he's blowing up doing big band jazz, you know, and it doesn't sound dated. In fact, if you watch a lot of like 50s and 60s movies, the sound that you attribute to those movies is really songs of his jazz albums, you know? And for a comparison, listen to Moaning and listen to the original by Bobby Timmons, the greatest version by Art Blakey, and then compare that to his version, you know, and his birth of the big band. But he says in the documentary that Dinah Washington, For Those in Love LP of 1956, is really where he got his big chance to really really arrange and produce. And for me, I think that when we look at his arrangements, we start to see that it's the arrangement. To define arrangement is the placement of everything and the timing of everything. And I felt, and I always have felt, that he has a consistently mind-blowing gift of highlighting the best part of the next instrument in the next measure every time. So every time every next measure comes in, the next instrument he's going to use always pops in where a casual listener would catch it. And that's what's the difference. When you listen to somebody like Thelonious Monk, he doesn't give a shit about what you're hearing. He gives a shit about what he's doing. So he's playing for players, especially people like John Coltrane. They're playing for players. You know, just like MCs, they're like the rapidy rap and they're doing all these things. They're rapping for the skill sets to be appreciated. And if you're a listener that doesn't understand the depth of those skill sets, fuck you then. You know what I mean? But in this case, Quincy Jones has that ability to really highlight stuff where you casually see like, wow, especially in this Dinah Washington record, you're like, wow, look at, that's where you hear the way that guitar came in. And these are accentuating points that are highlighted in such a way where he isolates very well, very well. So a good song that shows that is You Don't Know What Love Is. That's one of my favorite jazz ballad standards. And the one that Dinah Washington does under his arrangement is perfect because it punctuates her phrases with these lovely guitar strings. And I'll probably repeat it later, but I think that my favorite non-vocal instrument that he arranged has always been the guitar. He's always been a master at arranging the guitar. And we're going to see examples where I think I can prove a little bit. The other thing is this. In this jazz era, we see a constant, when I teach my students, I say there's only two things happening in all life. I say it's preparation and performance. And a real master is one that blends the two. So when he's performing, it's really a preparation for something else. And when he's preparing, it's really done as a performance because it's most important to him. And in Quincy's jazz era, we already see someone who's performing, but if you really listen to it in these days, knowing his whole catalog, you could tell that it was really a preparation for what he was trying to get into. And I think one of the better examples of seeing that is in his I Dig Dancers LP of 1960, you know? They were commercial forays that went better at more overtly blending into cross-cultural genres of the black diaspora. Like they do like an Asian song and you hear the Japanese instruments and they call it hot sake. And you're like, wow, yeah. But you never lose track of it being a Japanese tinge song. Whereas other people like, I got to punch this up. I knew I was going to forget to do it. But Horace Silver has a record where he did that too. And it's actually, if you're more technical with it and you like that hard bop sound, you'll like this better. or I like it better. But if you listen to Tokyo Blues, that album from Horace Silver, he's got the Japanese elements, and he went into that kind of music to blend into his blues hard bop. But at times, the casual listener can lose the world music element in the music. Whereas with Quincy, he had a very natural pop realm of getting it all in. This is important, though. This is really, really important because there's two things that happen in the late 60s career. He starts to working with Count Basie's orchestra. They get asked to work, Frank Sinatra asked to work with them, and they do come the Fly Me to the Moon, and they do that entire album, Hit Me with the Strings, right? And so what happens is this, right? At the same time, that's 1964. And a good example of something where like he's experimenting, and he knows he's experimenting with something that's really well done so he could try new things. So I give you the examples of the Hit Me with Strings album with Frank Sinatra, and then the next year, 1965, the Viva Vaughn album with Sarah Vaughan, right, that he produces. Sarah Vaughan, to me, is the most talented jazz singer of all time. She has every register in tone. She has all of the gifts. She could do everything, though. So I put her at if I put my trilogy of Sarah, Ella, and Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday, as far as talent, I got to put Sarah at that peak capstone at the top. And I didn't say he did this on purpose, but because Sarah Vaughan is so skilled, he could try things with Latin rhythms. That's why they called it Viva Vaughn, by the way. It was with Latin rhythms, mixing in Latin rhythms, Brazilian rhythms, Cuban rhythms. And I say Cuban rhythms because a lot of the Puerto Rican rhythms weren't in there yet. And a lot of salsa rhythms that you see in the 70s, that version mixed with jazz, are not in there yet. And Viva Vaughn is a record that has a lot of holes in it, And in general, by the way, for my ears, there's a lot of classics like Bobby Hutcherson and other artists that have made classics mixing in Latin music. But I find Dizzy Gillespie is the only one that has really made the greatest works of that, where they don't sound like some cha-cha-cha mambo shit. Because when you mix like Cuban rhythms diluted along with jazz, everything sounds like elevator music, like da, 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 da. How are you doing? I love you, Juanita. I don't think I'm ever gonna leave Cuba, I'm not leaving without you, It's shit like that, right? So a lot of the shit sounds like that, and Viva Vaughn sounds a lot like that, but her voice is so powerful and so unique. So let me give you something though. Two reasons that happens, that flaw, by the way. There's a lack of solos for the conga, bongo, or timbala that using these arrangements. So the Latin rhythms are often not infused properly into the jazz aesthetic. In other words, they're not doing jazz. They're in there, but they're not doing jazz. And number two is that the limitation infusing the Latin drums polyrhythmically, unless it's a straight adapted mambo like the song Avalon and Viva Vaughn. So, in other words, they had problems with interjecting that polyrhythm, And as a side note, the polyrhythms of jazz are in there. They're just not in the rhythm section. Okay? Until Dizzy starts working with Cuban musicians like Chano Pozo and others, the Cuban rhythms the polyrhythms, the African polyrhythms that the Latins bring are in the drum, whereas theirs are recreated or almost brought out of themselves into the horn sections. So anyway, I'm going to skip along with that. That's another realm. And by the way, Quincy did acknowledge that salsa came from New York, from Puerto Ricans and Cubans. So he knew about that too, right? So let's skip along with this foundation of making jazz well respected, but also in a pop realm by using big bands. It goes into his film scores, right? Here's a note about the film score. The magic of a film score is that it preps Quincy for having future success in that it blends in the overt and the subtle infusion. When you hear a musical score in a movie, there are two things that happen. You appreciate the music without noticing, and you also have to appreciate the music by noticing it. And this is key to the actual preparation that Quincy Jones is going through, because at certain points in the movie, you can watch these movies and go like, yo, that beat is crazy. What the fuck I just heard in here, right? And then at others, though, it just augments the scene, and you don't think too much about it unless you hear it separately as an album. And by doing these two things, by mastering these two things, and in the documentary, he notes in 1957 he went to Paris to study with Nadia Bollinger, and she had told him a theme of his that stuck with him was that there are only 13 notes, and you should investigate what everyone has done with these 12 notes. Excuse me. There are only 12 notes, and you should investigate everything that was done with these 12 notes. And in these scores is where he's really experimenting. And I just want to bring out something. He says, France made me feel free as an artist and as a black man. This is something in other episodes where I'm going to talk about the traveling black artist. And that'll include Latino artists going to other countries as well as Americans, African Americans going to other countries. Because I think it's different than the average black person. They see a different thing than the average black person. But to talk about this, right? This freedom gets extended to what I think are, to me, my favorite peaks in his scoring is that he's able to tell a story and augment it. If that's what a score is able to do, I think he did it best with the aforementioned scores I talked about, the Sidney Poitier movies. I think he worked harder for Sidney Poitier, and I think my favorite was The Lost Man. Aside from Lost Man being used for, if you listen in, you'll hear Primo for Group Home. You'll hear, who was it? I had written it down. Biz Markie, I forgot the name of the album, but it was 1992. It was the album where Biz Markie was sued for Alone Again, and they had to redo the album without that song. Of course, I have that song, but that was Biz Markie's best production effort, and a lot of the sinister themes and vibe, it went perfect with what he was sampling from Lost Man. And there's an intensity in this. And these scores, along with a lot of others, including In Cold Blood, which he won awards for, I think that Quincy Jones is an unrecognized pioneer in bringing a sinister funk into the score. And the reason is because we don't necessarily see how he's a precursor to Curtis Mayfield's Superfly, to the Isaac Hayes work in the because he didn't just do Shaft, he did other films that were really good, like, the Big Truck Turner and all that shit, right?
Back Truck Turner.
Yeah, and those beats, there was crazy beats in it. And when you listen to what he was doing in The Heat of the Night and in others, he was taking the blues and using and playing it in a funk fashion. Because there's a loop that goes on in a movie. Because movies scores use motifs. They use selected ideas to continue to go forward. So that's why you see like the familiar music, like, the kissing romantic scene. You see this scene, the major theme of the movie, right? And a lot of his best motifs were with the straight funk. You know what I'm saying? And just to give people an idea, because they may not have heard or seen these movies, think of how the funk of Sanford and Son theme, and compare that to a cop show like Ironside. There's a funk that's going on that it's either overt like Sanford and Son, or it's covert like it was in the Ironside. And doing all these scores really amplify his ability to make motifs like that. You need motifs when you make a pop song, because that's what you're repeating. So the next era becomes where he starts to engage in that in his solo recordings, and I call that the funk jazz era, from 69 to 74. From 1969, you have Walking in Space, which, by the way, as a fun fact, is what he says, which probably is true, is the first album in jazz to use a Fender bass. And by doing that, you hear a different funk rhythm. You allow them to go into the funk more, And what I mean by the funk is diving into those drums harder and more repetitively. That's why funk is such a precursor to hip-hop, right? But I think the pinnacle album is the Gula Matari album in 1970, right? We'll just look at the title track as a blueprint of what he would do for Roots, the Roots soundtrack and score, right? Alex Haley's Roots. And I say that these are, like I said, these are funk, but their root core is really in blues. And by extending that, though, he was able to make these motifs, and also able to bring the guitar aspect into the funk. And this helps people like George Benson later, right? Because George Benson is the shit. But he gives you that smooth funk with the jazz tinge. So when a good example, go to that Gula Matari album and listen to the title track and find that Grand Puba Black Family Day sample that he used. That's where you see the mastery of the arrangements of guitars, right? So another song is like, and I'm just giving you highlights. There's the song Guitar Blues Odyssey in the Smackwater Jack album 71, where you see he gives an entire changing of the guitar sound and gives the evolution of the guitar in one sound through all the different type of blues, from the core blues to the Delta to the New Orleans, all of that stuff, and goes all through to today's sound. It's brilliant. And then nearing the end of that, I put You've Got It Bad Girl, that album from 1973, a different blueprint because he's mixing original funk works with his reworking of standards, right? Which is like the title track with Stevie Wonder song, right? This is really where he's able to apply, he starts to apply what he learned from scoring into making motifs in the funk. So then we have the most favorite era, the pop soul era, and I'll call it from 1974 to 1995 because there's a couple of albums after that. But fuck that last one. The last one has T-Pain, and even he says that T-Pain fucked it up. So we're not even going to talk about that one. You don't need to have that. But the Q's joint from 1995, that's a good album, by the way. That was a good one, right? But one of the errors that people have, especially interviews, that they see, there's an error in seeing a grand transition where like he learned disco and pop from the Brothers Johnson work and then was able to do Michael Jackson, where in fact it's the opposite. He already knew what he was doing, so he was able to pop out Brothers Johnson further and then was able to do the same thing with his own albums and then eventually leading into Michael Jackson, right? So that's why I cut this era into the funk jazz, from funk jazz to the soul era, because the albums like 74's Body Heat have the funk, but they start to use vocals better, right? So to fast forward through some of those things, right? We get the deep funk with more R&B-ish vocals like Paranoid and the Mellow Madness LP, right? And there's a lot of sinister grooves there, but he's able to pop them out in a different way. You got Sounds, the two albums, Sounds and Stuff Like That of 78, and The Dude. And then in between those, you have George Benson's Give Me the Night, right? Which is essential. You need to have that shit. Because I love George Benson's catalog, but that's his pinnacle of his commercial peak. And it was produced by Quincy because, and the magic of that is because the type of singers that Quincy really became a master of. You know what I mean? So let's go through, because we're going through the end here. Let me talk about MJ, because we talk about MJ, the quick highlights, right? When we talk about Michael Jackson, right? The three albums, Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad, that he did. When we talk about pop, a little focus here. Pop is about selling black ideas and expression in such a diversity that its intensity is diluted. So listen to what I said. Selling black ideas and thought in such a diversity that its intensity in each one is diluted. The thing about it, right, is that he was perfect for that, right? So Quincy was so perfect at that when he did Off the Wall, he was able to merge those disco sensibilities with the R&B sensibilities that Michael Jackson naturally had, right? With Thriller, all that's happening there and what makes it more pop is that the actual funk, it becomes more of a funk rock album. And so a lot of the drive that you see in the funk is taken in more of a rock style, of a stabbing style, like Beat It and Thriller. Those funk breaks are more like a stabbing rock song as opposed to like the way a funk song would groove in it. That was the magic of those. Bad, just by the time Bad comes about, the pop is already established as a type of rock, so it seems a little bit more, it's more cliche, more stereotypical, the sound, and isn't there. But one note about what he was doing. His magic was using the light, airy singers, the powerful guys that weren't offensive. So we have the failures earlier, like with What's Going On, when he had somebody remake that on the 71 album. But by now, he has mastered all of the guys with it. So he has James Ingram, George Benson, Tevin Campbell, the Youth, and of course the pinnacle, Michael Jackson. So it's the use of these techniques is best seen in the singing, um, by slowing down the technique, right? You slow down the technique and have on an emphasis on a detail that can be amplified, right? So here's what you have, right? You have more appeal in an easier relation. So, for example, when you slow down bebop, you get what Miles Davis was doing. Very complex, but easier for the listener to get. This is what he was doing with the singers. So a good contrast is like if you listen to Everything Must Change and hear the difference between the Quincy's version with Leon Ware and compare it to my favorite by Walter Jackson. There's no gruff in it. There's no gruff in the vocals. So what happens is that it can appeal universally. And also, too, another thing you used to have singers do is what Donnie and Roberta Flack used to do. Donnie Hathaway, Roberta Flack. They used to operatically end their bars, like the ends of their words. So, when you would sing "Everything must change, nothing stays the same," like everything is intense in there, and there's an enunciation and an extension at the end with extreme clarity. Something you didn't really see in soul at the time, even in the 70s, right? So I'm going to end this perspective with one last thing, because I think Back on the Block does everything that accentuates everything he was saying about bebop to hip hop, and I already explained that. But I want to give one last ending nod to, I think, who's the most underrated artist in the Quincy catalog that people don't research, and her impact. And I think it's Patty Austin. Because Patty Austin not only is a backup singer to many of the core tracks, but many of the best songs that are sung by Quincy Jones are the duets she did with James Ingram, her own solo songs, and she kind of lent a guideline for the other male singers on how to reach that peak with air, and it kind of merges a go-between toward that, you know what I mean? Because there are no singers in the Quincy Jones catalog that sing falsettos, right? And yet they sing in an airy tone. So he found his own pop lane, and I just found that magnificent. But that kind of ends the this whole Quincy Jones appreciation episode. With that said, I think that I'm going to have a lot more shows like this where I go through classic crates in an extended way like Quincy Jones. You need to listen. You need to watch that Quincy documentary, see these ideas. I'll be building out more of these ideas in more depth later with other artists included into it. But, until then, as always, we'll have more stories to tell, writings to recite, and records to rewind and reminisce. For now, I'm your host, Sunez. And as always, the Power Right Show is a never respect fake broadcast. Peace.